Well, hello and welcome. My name is Sheila Wilson. I am a host on Passionate World Talk Radio. The CEO of Passionate World Talk Radio is Lillian Cauldwell, and her station manager is Jeanne White. I have a nonprofit called Stop Healthcare Violence. I also have a website, and that's also called Stop Healthcare Violence. Facebook is Stop Healthcare Violence and Heal the Healer. Today, my guest is Deborah Foggy. She has been on the show before. Deborah founded Dignity Together after she experienced a situation at work. Deborah feels all employees deserve dignity and respect at work for their well-being, and I totally agree with her there. Today, she will be speaking on Workplace Psychological Safety Acts. Hello, Deborah, and how are you?
Hi, Sheila. Good. How are you?
I am wonderful. It's nice to hear your voice, and I'm sorry if I didn't say your last name correctly.
Oh, that's okay. It happens all the time.
So tell me about this Workplace Psychological Safety Act. What is that all about?
So we are introducing, there's a new organization we started called End Workplace Abuse, where we've identified about 24 different workers' rights that we're trying to push for across the country in all 50 states. These are state bills. And as part of that work, we are introducing the Workplace Psychological Safety Act that is pushing for protections for workers from workplace bullying and mobbing, or what we call workplace psychological abuse. So the kind of background of this is that a lot of people who've been through a toxic workplace realize when they're going through it, or once they've gone through it, that they don't have legal protections unless they can prove that their mistreatment was due to discrimination. And then when they even take that route, if it applies to them, they realize that anti-discrimination law isn't even that effective. In fact, there's this great book called Rights on Trial, where three researchers who are professors looked at anti-discrimination law over the long term. They looked at Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and what's happened since then, and really took a deep dive into, whether it's been effective or not, and realized for multiple reasons that it hasn't been effective. So we're acknowledging that abuse at work has a discriminatory impact. More women than men are harmed by it, and also more people of color than white people are harmed by it. So acknowledging that we're in this system of stereotypes and bias that anti-discrimination law hasn't been effective at tackling, because in the 1980s and the Reagan era, the courts moved from looking at discriminatory impact, which made the law effective in its early years. They were able to look at pay equity and hiring and firing practices, and people who had lawsuits actually were able to get positive results from that. But during that shift in the 80s and 90s, when the courts started looking at discriminatory intent, the effectiveness of anti-discrimination law really plummeted. And, with women and people of color, and also people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ community, people who are othered by people who typically have power, which is men or, white workers, these people typically find that anti-discrimination law doesn't work for them especially because of that need to prove discriminatory intent. So what the Workplace Psychological Safety Act does is look at the behaviors, and especially typical behaviors around workplace bullying and mobbing that need to be addressed by employers that are not currently being addressed because they don't fall under discrimination. And in fact, a lot of times employers also don't address discrimination, because what happens is that an employee going through a training program and seeing the policies of their workplace think that going to human resources will actually result in some kind of change. But when they do that, they're often either ignored or vilified, made to be the problem because the employer doesn't want to take on that legal liability. They're being advised by their legal department to typically not address these situations, especially when it's a bullying or mobbing situation that is not covered by existing law. So we are trying to fill a gap in the law with this Workplace Psychological Safety Act, and we are at a baseline. This bill will give targeted employees legal recourse for a toxic work environment, and then it will also have requirements for employers. They need to, still address the policy and training aspects. So they need to acknowledge that this is happening and notify their employees that it is illegal once it becomes illegal, but also monitor their work cultures through surveys, and once it's brought to their attention, this is really where employees don't have luck or success with their employers. So we're saying that employers will be required to conduct an investigation, a neutral investigation, within a certain amount of time. We've outlined 30 days, and to communicate with the employee what's happening, and then to also address it. So whether that's coaching or counseling for the offender, or some kind of disciplinary action, removing supervisory responsibilities from them or terminating them, depending on what happened, that's what is involved or incorporated into this bill. And there's a lot of debate in this workplace anti-bullying space of, should we focus on intent? Should we wait for health harm? And we want to make this, or we have made this bill more in line with the way sexual harassment law works, which doesn't require proof of intent. It doesn't require proof of health harm. We don't want to wait till an employee's health is harmed in order for them to have a legal claim. We want to get at the toxic environment when it's happening, and we want people to have legal recourse for that, which in turn will prevent these behaviors from happening in the first place. So the reason that they're happening is because employers aren't held accountable for not addressing these situations. So that's the kind of overview of what we're trying to do, and we've had some success. We've only been at this for less than a year now, and we have one active bill in Massachusetts. We have part of this bill introduced in Maryland, and then we also have, we're waiting on actual bill numbers in language in Rhode Island, Texas, and Oregon. So we're really excited about the progress we've made. There are a lot of people who this issue resonates with, especially in nursing, in teaching, and nonprofits, and government, a lot of social service industries where people want the organization to do well, and they want their clients and the people they serve to do well and to succeed. You have one person who comes in and has a personal agenda, and they can really cause a major disruption and do a lot of damage for people who are often high performers and want to come in and see their organization succeed.
So, well, that was quite a bit, Deborah. What can an employee do right away? I mean, if they're getting bullied, what do you think their first step is if they want to stay on the job?
I mean, the first steps are typically, trying to look at the situation and understanding if they did something that could cause it, and having an honest conversation with the person, if and only it seems like it could be a conflict. Now, abuse is not conflict, so if it's clear-cut abuse, or a toxic culture where the abuse might not be clear-cut, but they're feeling devalued and belittled and just demoralized, and they don't feel like their strengths and the skills that they're bringing to the job are really being valued. They can report to HR, but I would only recommend that if they've actually witnessed success with other employees experiencing that. And collective action is by far the most effective action you can take internally. But more often than not, and there's data out there that says that by some researchers' standards that around 70% of workplaces are deemed toxic. So that avenue is probably not going to work. So the best thing that workers can do is to actually find a workplace that is, where they can be valued. So in the short term, that means understanding the abuse playbook, that, there's probably a false narrative going on behind the scenes to, make the employee look bad. Like I said, it's usually a high performer whose high performance and ethics are a threat to the bully. So the bully won't only make the employee feel like they're inadequate oftentimes, but they'll also start this narrative with other employees so that isolation starts. People feel like they not only can't have job control anymore, but they're losing their social support at work. So the best thing to do is to realize that that's not an environment that's going to be healthy long-term or safe, and they can try to detach from it as much as possible in the short term while they're building a safety net, whether that's finding another job, starting a side hustle, taking a break if there's some kind of safety net that they can fall back on. I mean, there are a lot of losses involved with being abused at work. Whether that's actually losing the job or losing connections or having damage to their mental health, which can then in turn affect their physical health. If they're experiencing stress-related symptoms, anxiety, depression, signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it can escalate from there. We've actually seen suicidal ideation from this, suicides from this, because people feel trapped and feel like there's nowhere to turn, there's no way to, legally address this. They're not only betrayed by the bully, but they're betrayed by the actual employer, and then they're also betrayed by a culture, an actual legal system that isn't addressing this issue. So there's many layers of betrayal that happen. So the best thing to do is to detach from it as much as possible, to really try to get clarity on this abuser playbook, why it's happening, how it's happening, until you can escape the toxic work environment. Just like domestic abuse, where people's self-worth is beaten down and there's a lot of self-blame, but ultimately the environment is typically not going to change, and the best course of action is to get out once the person feels safe to do so. Or in that environment, in the workplace, it would be once you have a safety net to, be able to leave. Because leaving also involves losing your paycheck and all of the stresses that can come with that. So employees in this situation are faced with deciding between their health and a paycheck, and we want to make, choosing their health the safest decision, the safest option possible by making that departure from the workplace as stress-free as possible.
That is really. Do you have any stats on that? Like in Stop Healthcare Violence, I'll look at a lot of sites that will say that 30% of the nurses get assaulted, but in reality, after a survey was done by two major nursing unions, 70 to 80% of the healthcare workers and nurses get assaulted. And it's like, why do we stay? And, this is just about what you're talking about. It's not so much from the employer, except the employer does do nothing.
Yeah.
They know about the abuse, and they say, well, I mean, I no longer are in the hospital setting, but I bet I have 6 or 7 nurses that I worked with out on disability forever because they were injured so bad. And that's physically. Now, once those heal, you have your head that constantly goes over and over that episode, which I'm sure that you're talking about with the employees in a job. That they, you go home at night and you think about what happened during the day, and even though you're not marked up with black and blue and maybe even a shoulder injury or back injury or whatever happened, that your head constantly talks. And it's really the mental aggravation of all this. Did you find that?
Yeah, I mean, so
that
speaks to
about,
that.
Right?
Yeah, that strong mind-body connection there, where whether it is physical violence or psychological violence, because they're both violence, they're both trauma, and so one is going to affect the other, whether it's the actual physical violence that you're working on or the psychological violence that we're working on through this through end workplace abuse. It's actually interesting you bring this up because there's a woman in Canada named Dr. Jennifer Fraser who just last year authored this book called The Bullied Brain, where it's really extensive research on the neuroscience behind psychological violence, and she says that these psychologically violent behaviors actually show up on brain scans. So even psychological violence is physical violence. It's just not visible physical violence. It's, affecting our cardiovascular systems and our nervous systems and our brains, and it's just not visible. But to speak to your earlier question, the stats on this epidemic, on this phenomenon, kind of are across the board. So the Workplace Bullying Institute puts it around 27% or so of employees who've experienced workplace bullying during their careers. And I should say, too, that among all of these different surveys, workplace bullying doesn't always have the same definition. Sometimes intent is in there, or health harm might be in there, or there might just be a different definition of it. But we did a survey in Massachusetts, I think it was 2 years ago now, and most of our respondents, we had roughly 500 respondents, most of them being public, state employees, and 67% of them had responded that they've been bullied at some point during the course of their careers. And it was, again, more women than men, more people of color than white workers, and across the board, targets were the ones who had been either fired or pushed out, and bullies, stayed in their workplaces for the most part without consequences. And they're really these people these respondents to the survey also really reported that there weren't avenues that they could take that would help them. So, not only did going to HR not help them, but friends and family didn't really understand it per se. Their therapists weren't necessarily helpful in general. I mean, there are of course supportive friends and family and supportive therapists and even supportive employers. But on the whole, there aren't many places to go to receive support. I think, and on the one hand, workplace bullying or workplace abuse is not a household term, and we don't, it's not as widely known as domestic abuse. But also, I think people are fearful that they could become the next target, or that they're fearful that we live in a system that operates in this hierarchical manner, especially around, with this discriminatory aspect to it, and they could become the next target. And I think that's a hard fact for people to accept, that if they are just going into work and doing their jobs, they could also become the next target and have their lives very disrupted by not just the emotional aspect, but also the financial loss, the social support loss, the loss around identity, things I've mentioned earlier around. There's just so many losses where people who've experienced this, often describe it as like an attack on their personhood, because they're not being treated as humans. They're being treated as means to an end to boost the personal agenda of the person who's bullying.
Again, talking about workplace violence for the nurses, is that a lot of the nurses don't let administration know what had happened. So a patient assaults them, they don't write out incident reports. And then during the work that I've been doing, I find out they don't even tell their family. Excuse me. They're afraid to talk to their family because the family would say, well, what's the matter with you? Why did you let that happen? And it's kind of like what you were just talking about. They blame the person. Nurses don't cause the people that assault them. When I was young, I was a medical assistant, having a nice conversation with a young man that lived in the same community as I did. I went to school with his brother. He just hauled off and punched me right in the face for absolutely no reason.
Wow.
And then people were saying, well, what did you say to him? Why did he do that? Well, we were just having a conversation. And that's what it seems like that you're saying about the employees and the people that are getting bullied.
Yeah.
Do I have that correct?
Yeah, when I experienced workplace bullying personally and went to human resources, in hindsight, I wish that I hadn't done it, because the behavior from the bully escalated, and typically HR and higher-ups side with the bully because it's easier to. Some of these situations are, he said, she said situations, and it's difficult for them to understand what's happening. But a lot of targets of workplace abuse have emails and paper, they've documented what's happened. So this isn't, it becomes more than a he said, she said, or she said situation. But yet employers still ignore the situation because it's easier to. It's easier to see this as a problem with the person who's been targeted and victimized than a problem with the abuser. I think the second piece to this is that a lot of these stories are so shocking, both like in the moment to the target and when the target explains them to other people, that people just think like they had to have done something to provoke this, but that's usually not the case. Abuse is abuse, and certainly there are situations where conflict resolution skills would be helpful, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is actually abusive situations where it could be a coworker, but especially people in power can make different decisions about how they are using their power. And in these situations, they're misusing their power. They have a responsibility, in my eyes, to treat their employees like human beings, but they're actually misusing their power, sometimes in shocking ways. And it's a hard thing for people to understand, that like I said, they could become the next victim too if, if they choose to believe that these things happen, that means also understanding that they could be victimized as well. And I think it is interesting that this happens so much in professions where employees want to do good in this world, and that those types of people, which we should all be, in my opinion, are kind of ripe for being targeted, because we often get blindsided by these personal toxic agendas because we don't think that same way. And yet they can all come from the same place of, childhood trauma, of feeling shamed a lot in childhood, and they just manifest differently and create a lot of damage.
These people in power, they know exactly what they're doing. Do you feel the same way? They know that they're bullying people.
In a lot of cases, yeah. I mean, in some cases, there can be people in power who just they're not trained to manage. And that, that's some of these people. But in a lot of other cases, there could be narcissistic tendencies, psychopathic tendencies, people who, elbow their way into these power positions and then just wreak havoc. So it can be either. What's most shocking to me is that, shocking and not shocking, but the employers don't address it when it happens, that they would be okay with these behaviors happening and affecting their bottom lines and affecting absenteeism rates and turnover rates, and these behaviors do damage to the businesses themselves and organizations, and they don't, whether they see that or not, I'm not entirely sure. A lot of the data, the research shows that they're not aware, even if they've experienced these behaviors themselves. But it is their responsibility to become aware of these things and protect their own employees, just as a parent should be protecting their children.
Right. Well, going back again about the nurses, when a patient comes in and they assault one of our nurses or healthcare workers or x-ray techs, or if they assault anybody, I felt as though, and I made it very clear, and I'm sure a lot of other people said the same thing, please put it on their chart. Just put a red dot. Do something to make the next person that's going to take care of him know that he assaulted or she assaulted or they assaulted, whatever, or who got assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a hard time doing that. Now, a simple thing, that would be a solution as far as I would be concerned, that if I looked in the computer and saw a red dot or something like that that says this person assaulted somebody in the past, I would be more apt to treat him or her a little bit differently. And, just being aware, I could certainly keep my distance. I wouldn't be putting my arm over to put an IV in. I'd make it, I'd be aware of the situation that person had before. And like you said, your employers really aren't giving a darn. They're well aware of what's going on, but they don't do anything. And that's how I feel in the nurse world, is that you can do your job, then you end up getting assaulted, but you don't write an incident report. So maybe that's the reason why. Maybe we're killing our own selves by not writing the incident reports. But maybe we go to, the health center in the hospital and get checked out. I just feel sometimes between your work and my work, it's like a dead end some days. I just wish there was something in the solutions out there that we don't have to go through all of this turmoil.
Yeah,
Am I making myself clear?
Yeah, it seems like in all of these instances, situations where employers have the ability to police themselves because there's no authority doing that, keeping them in check. I mean, we have environmental regulations because we as a culture, as a society, want to address, climate change and environmental harm. But we don't take that same approach with human well-being at work. And I think that's one of the major problems. I mean, especially when you look at how much money some of the business side of hospitals, how much of a salary some of these people are taking in. It seems like these hospitals are just so focused on profits that, without actually working in the medical industry, it seems from an outsider that that's sort of the goal, and that anything that's taking away from, the number of patients people are, doctors and nurses are seeing, anything that distracts from that bottom line just seems to be not worth their time, which it would be interesting to do an analysis of hospitals specifically. I don't know if that research is out there to see, how much that is actually costing. I mean, we know it's costing lives, costing in patient care, and it's a reason for all of us to have an interest in this, because if we end up in the hospital, it's going to affect our own care or family members' care.
Right.
But for them to not, address that there should be consequences for that. It's negligent and it's disgusting, really.
It is. It is. Before we have to sign off, Deborah, I wanted to ask you a question, and I know that you've explained it before, but for the new people that may be listening to them, could you explain what mobbing is?
Sure. Mobbing in general is essentially group bullying. In terms of how we define it with the work that we do, we call mobbing bullying at the organizational level. So I kind of think of this as like a David versus Goliath, or one person against an army. When someone's being bullied by one person, that's toxic enough, but when that person really spreads their own false narrative to coworkers, to their boss, to then HR and higher ups, it becomes one person versus an army. And so that mob mentality kicks in, where the bullying is not just done by that one person, but an entire group who is driven by this false narrative. So, a lot of bullying escalates into mobbing because of how the bully operates in terms of really being driven by that false narrative. So that's kind of a nutshell of how mobbing works and what it is.
That's very, very interesting, because you could actually set that up easy. And, some people could just make fun of somebody and the other one is talking behind their back. And that is really a terrible thing to do to anybody.
Yeah, it's
just one more.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say we have a couple of more minutes. Is there anything else that you would like to do? And I want to thank you for explaining that.
Sure. Just if people are interested in getting involved in this work, I mean, we're trying to build a national movement around it. They can go to endworkplaceabuse.com, where there are actions in nearly every state where they can push for different issues, whether that's like banning non-disclosure agreements or bills around pay equity, wage transparency, 24 different issues that we've identified that people can take action on now in their states. But specifically with this issue, they can go to workplacepsychologicalsafetyact.org and take action in a number of states. Maryland in particular has action to take. Oregon, where you can email just through a very easy, simple to use form in about 30 seconds, have a message off to some key decision makers without even having to live there. But you can also see some of the actions that we're also taking in other states where they have similar legislation that we believe needs to be strengthened. So New York, Pennsylvania will have that. But also to just get involved. There's plenty of work to be done with outreach, marketing, fundraising, research, a whole host of areas that we need help in. So on endworkplaceabuse.com or workplacepsychologicalsafetyact.org, people can find information on how to get involved.
Well, thank you very much. And you'll come on the show again?
Absolutely. I always appreciate you having me on here, Sheila. So I would love to come back.
I think you're awesome. We're just going to stop now, and I'll say good evening or good afternoon. Thank you, Deborah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me.